Welcome. This is just a short introduction to show how EmpowerID can rely on Azure native authentication for organizations that wish Azure AD to be their primary authentication even when they're logging into EmpowerID. Now, of course, EmpowerID is an identity provider and can provide single sign-on and multi-factor authentication to your applications, but it can also rely on Azure AD and not prompt users for an authentication to EmpowerID. In this environment, we're on the EmpowerID login page, and we have multiple options enabled, and that's why we're seeing this login page. For an organization that wanted Azure AD seamless authentication and not see this page, all you would do is configure for this URL to only have a single identity provider option. And in that case, it would be Azure. So then users, when they're redirected to this page, it would skip this and instantly send them into Azure for a native authentication experience, and they would never see this page again. So let's click here as if we were a user that was redirected in for Azure native authentication. We can see it's taken us in as this user. This user, Microsoft remembers that I've logged in before. I can log in with my Microsoft account and any MFA options that Microsoft might prompt me for. And then I've now authenticated to the identity provider, which is Azure AD. It's redirected me back to EmpowerID. Now, something interesting happens here. EmpowerID has a deep integration with Azure. So if a user performs multi-factor authentication in Azure, EmpowerID queries their OpenID Connect endpoints and actually gathers that information. So the Azure multi-factor authentication can count as a native EmpowerID authentication. Therefore, when a user is in EmpowerID and they're performing a privileged task like privileged access management that might require multi-factor to be a trusted identity, we can trust the Azure multi-factor authentication and use it as if it were a native EmpowerID multi-factor. So we see in this case the user was prompted to go to Azure. They logged in with their Azure credentials, and then they're back in EmpowerID. So EmpowerID doesn't have to be the login interface, and you can rely on Azure for a seamless experience. Even if this user were to access downstream applications that were federated off of EmpowerID, they would not be prompted to log in again.